All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Michael Workman. I am the growth director here at ResinSmart, powered by RTI. I want to thank all of you for taking the time to join us today. We built this session for really one purpose, the fact that the plastic resin distribution landscape has changed pretty dramatically in the last few years. Resin buyers deserve to have a clear and honest conversation about what that means and how that will shape their strategy as they move into 2026. If you spend any time in this industry, you already know that distribution is one of the most important, but perhaps one of the least fully understood and most talked about topics in private conversations. It's almost never addressed openly. There's questions around, that we get from clients and people that we talk to. Why can't I get certain quotes from certain distributors? Why does every RFQ come back with a similar price? Is consolidation limiting my options, or is it actually a benefit for me? And what does it all mean as we move into the new year and beyond? We're going to talk about those things here today in a direct but very responsible and factual way, because the truth is that distribution is one of the most important levers in resin procurement. And that's even true for bigger folks if leveraged the right way. And a lot of the playbooks that are being used right now in the industry are from 5 to 10 years ago, and it's just a completely different market today. Thankfully, I'm joined by two people, my colleagues who have lived this from every angle. Kevin Mekaru, Senior Business Unit Leader for Polyethylene and PET here at ResinSmart, and Tyler, who is the Senior Business Unit Leader for Engineered Materials. Hey guys, I mean, together you've worked in resin purchasing for 40 years and worked with hundreds of processors on just these types of changes, right? And helping them develop strategies. So the goal today again is to give you clarity, confidence, and a strategy to roll forward with in the next year. Before we get too deep into the weeds, though, I do want to acknowledge that we've got a pretty mixed group here that I see. Some folks that have been doing this for decades, and others that are very, very new to plastic purchasing. So before we get to into the weeds, I'm just going to I want us to take a couple minutes to level set and talk about the distribution structure in general and why it exists.
So, Michael, we're talking to processors. Some assume that distribution they make resin, and they don't. Their space is really between the producers and the buyers. Processors buy through distribution because they can't go direct, and the question is why. Well, producers really want to sell large volumes typically, and they don't want to manage thousands of different types of customers and smaller type of business, middle size accounts. So they take the complexity out of their business by going through distribution and setting up those networks. Distribution provides logistics, warehousing, faster responses to questions and so forth. And they have smaller minimum order quantities, credit terms, technical support. So it's a lot of different value proposition that they provide. They're essentially a supply chain infrastructure. They're not simply just to add a cost.
Kevin, producers fill rail cars of resin like every hour or 2 hours, right? They are a large machine that when they turn that faucet on, it goes into rail cars and goes out into the marketplace. Producers want to manage where those rail cars are going out into the marketplace, but they're not interested in taking it from a rail car into a bulk truck and delivering it. Sometimes they will do that. They will offer that service if it's close to a hub. But even more rare would be for a producer to actually take the resin, store it, box it out in a gaylord or a box that's being delivered to you on a regular 53-foot truck. That's where distribution shines, and that's where they really fill up a lot of the tailspin that organizations have because they break bulk from this, very large volume, always on hose, and they make it into much smaller, more manageable orders for the end consumer. And whereas sometimes it's an option and there's value provided with payment terms or higher service levels, oftentimes it's a requirement. You just simply can't get lower volume direct from a producer.
Yeah, couldn't agree more with that, Tyler. My background is, as you guys know, with Poly One distribution, now the Formera business, and I've been in and around distribution businesses since I started, and that is the model, right? Is breaking into bulk. The other thing I just wanted to mention is a lot of companies, a lot of buyers, a lot of processors utilize the services of those distribution that network of technical support, the account reps, right? Material recommendations. I mean, it's still a very important element of the value chain for processors and are going to continue to remain so. So perfect, guys. And now that we're grounded on what distribution looks like in the plastic supply chain, I want to take a moment to zoom out and talk about what's changed. And really, as we've been talking about, it's quite a bit. The distribution landscape is very different from COVID and then pre-COVID days even. So let's talk about some of those structural shifts and why they matter so much for plastic procurement teams.
The big news here is that, back in the day, you'd have producers that would partner direct with a distributor to bring their lower volumes to market. And oftentimes they would not want those distributors to compete against one another for their channel to bring their product to the marketplace. So there's this kind of a one-to-one correlation between this producer utilizes that distributor to service the end customer. So there used to be a fair amount of direct channels where if you wanted that producer's volume, you went with that distributor. But there's been a lot of sales, acquisitions, mergers in this space over the last 5 years, especially since COVID, as you mentioned. The elephant in the room that we talk about is Ravago. It controls a massive share of the resin distribution in North America. Billions of pounds of resin are moved through Ravago's doors every day. And you might not know the name Ravago, but you might know some of the companies that they own and at least have a majority ownership in, which includes Amco, Channel Prime Alliance, Entech, Mulestein, Genesis, Bamberger, Bamco, M. Holland, if I didn't mention it already, which is actually just took place, I think maybe about a little over a year ago. And why that's important is I think many companies were relying on, let's say, M. Holland was their number one distribution partner and Channel Prime Alliance was their number two. Well, then when Ravago purchases a controlling stake in M. Holland, well, now Ravago has become your number one and your number two, and likely your number 7 and 8, distributors all under one pool. That is one company with one line of credit that you are now in business with. So whether it's your customers that make a merger and acquisition and make demands back to you, or your supply base does so, it changes the dynamic and the leverage and some of the implications of the one-to-one distribution and production hierarchy that we saw in the past. So Ravago is the one that's getting a lot of discussion right now. In addition, there's kind of two others that occupy the majority players of this space, which would be private equity owned Formera, formerly Poly One, where you used to be, Michael, and then Nexio is the other one, owned by One Rock, I believe, the PE firm. So there's also certainly family owned companies. Shout out to the Shaw Polymers and the Ostermans of the world. And the Coventises. There is still a diverse marketplace out there, but when you look at the majority of pounds that are being fed through distribution, they're going through Ravago, Formera, and Nexio, top three first and foremost. And that's, a little different when you have one, almost like an oligopoly of one dominant Ravago supplier and then two private equity owned distributors.
Yeah, and that's a good point, Tyler, is there's definitely creating a lot of tension in that space because some buyers want to diversify away from large distributors for risk reasons. There's others that want to consolidate them for convenience and stability, for service consistency. So there's a lot of challenges there of moving large volumes within different distributors now that weren't there in the past. So, and we'll talk about some of the reasons for that, but it's definitely a lot more challenging than it was to switch around volumes as it was previously was.
Yeah, one of the things that I wanted to double back on, Tyler, you had brought up the private equity transition for both Nexio and Formera. Nexio is 4 years into their relationship with One Rock. Formera is still obviously getting started with HIG. Some of the experiences that Nexio has been having or had in the early stages are similar to what Formera is seeing. Looking into the crystal ball, you could compare the two from that perspective. There's also the element of just when you're private equity held, the reality of the situation is there's new leadership, often different expectations on growth, margin capture, tighter turns. We've seen both of these organizations want to prioritize holding inventory, perhaps less so than in the past. So these are just facts that we need to be considering as it relates to your operational budget for procurement into 2026. And related to some of those changes, another dynamic that we need to talk through is some of these producers have made different decisions with their channel in distribution, moving away from an exclusive distribution arrangement and more towards a multi-channel approach. A few examples of this, right? Sabic no longer exclusive with Nexio, also being able to be purchased through Amco, the Ravago network, and the newer player in the Northeast, Coventus. So now they've got a 3-channel approach for the market. Formera is a second example where in the past they were the only authorized distributor for the legacy DuPont business, which is Celanese. What was through Poly One and now Formera, but with that change to the Celanese leadership and just a desire to get their product out more into the market and hit their volume goals. They expanded their relationship with Ravago through NTEC, AMCO, and CPA, and also have regional distributors in both Canada and Mexico. So when a producer changes their distribution channel strategy, creates change for you as the buyer. And these are things that we can help you stay on top of. It doesn't automatically change and translate into leverage due to some of the channel management processes and rules that we're going to talk into more detail about here in a second. But what's coming next? I mean, we've talked about the resin pricing is very low right now. Almost historically low in polypropylene. When the market rebounds, the distributors are going to push aggressive and try to recapture some of the margin that's been lost. And the buyers that aren't prepared for that with the dynamics of who they work with are going to potentially lose out. Okay. So we've talked a lot about what's changed, but we need to talk about why those changes make life so complicated for buyers. To really understand what to do about all this, we need to actually go deeper and go behind the scenes further, which is where I'd like to go. This is the part that trips up even experienced folks at times.
So, Michael, just if we look at how distribution really works and we kind of pull back the curtain, resin producers rely on what's called channel managers to control which distributor can sell which product to which customer. Buyers often don't understand there's a triangular negotiation dynamic between the buyer and distributor and the producer, and the producer and the market. This is the reason why buyers can't simply just bid out everything to one distributor because they often can't quote on the SKUs that are appearing on their RFQ.
That was something I ran into a lot of when I was purchasing resin. Was I'd just say, well, here's all my resin and I really like this one distributor. Why can't you just, I mean, your function is to literally take the resin, put it into boxes, deliver it to me, maybe a little bit of inventory management and technical services. Why can't you do that for Sabic or LyondellBasell or Braskem or whatever my needs are? And that's where they say, well, we're limited by what we can sell on our line card. The producer won't let us sell that on their behalf. That's changing in the marketplace, as Michael had already mentioned. But that's where it becomes very difficult to consolidate your distribution partners because sometimes they don't represent the volumes that you need. Other times, there will be 2 distributors that both can represent that volume. And maybe you say, hey, I'm buying LyondellBasell resin from 2 different distributors. I only want to buy it from one distributor. Well, then you actually have to appeal back to LyondellBasell to inform them, hey, we would like only one distribution partner and we want it to be distributor A, not distributor B. And LyondellBasell would take the stance, hey, we're already winning because we're selling it to you anyway. We don't really care that much which channel it goes through. And we're not going to just flip-flop channels because it creates an administrative burden on our end. So that's what's called share shift in the industry. And to be able to do that, you need to be able to work with your salesperson at your distributor and together present a compelling and united front back to the producer to even enable a producer that can sell that volume to sell it to you. So that disconnect between going to the market with an RFQ, something we get a lot of feedback that large consultants do when they're brought on for projects. They just bring it all to market. They all get list price from the distributors. Minimal value is driven, and they don't understand why their 5-step sourcing isn't effective in resins, right? So I would say the disconnect between buyers' expectations on how line cards can work and approvals and channel management definitely conflicts with the way that it works behind the scenes.
Yeah, and to your point, Tyler, really what it comes down to is the channel manager tracks volume shifts. They control approvals and they limit quoting. So the buyers, if you're looking to involve producers directly, that's a good strategy when attempting to do major distribution changes to go about that route because it is very difficult and a lot more complex than it used to be.
So now that we've laid out some of the mechanics of how this works, the channel manager roles, I certainly remember working with mine. They were very essential in the process. The approvals, the quotes, and how those can be limited at times. Where some buyer missteps can happen, start to make a lot more sense. We consistently see really smart teams that we work with make some of these mistakes, and because of lack of effort or competency, it's the system just isn't intuitive. I know it certainly took me quite some time to learn it when I was first starting. So let's walk through the biggest traps, guys, that buyers fall into.
Yeah, I think it's making the assumption that distributors can offer the same thing or behave in the same way. That base assumption just falls apart on just a little bit of weight on it when you go to do an RFQ by just the limitations of the responses you get. I think people underestimate the role of the channel manager. I think they look at two different distributors and say, "Hey, you're the supplier. You're the one that's going to win on this business. You two fight it out." And they don't really have the power to do that because the producer isn't going to respond to the different distributors. They're going to respond to the demand of the end customer. So that's where that triangle comes in of kind of getting with your sales rep and going back upstream to the producer to pitch your case. Also, not taking advantage of changes in the distribution model. When a producer opens up a new distributor, are you going to take that approach of going back to the producer and saying, we have more options, things have changed, and we would like to know what value is in it for us? I think sometimes in procurement, they believe that they have more optionality than they actually do. There's certain places or cost economics that different distributors have based on where their warehouses are and what type of freight it costs to get it to wherever your plant is. It's not they have different competitive advantages and they're not just the same. And then also, I think buyers get taken advantage of in a way that if you talk to people in distribution, there are two metrics that matter most to them: volume and margin. So if you're not validating whatever price that you started with some type of benchmarking process, which the ResinSmart AI team is expert at helping you establish, then even if you gain savings over a period of time, you may very well still be kind of set the marker high early and are continuing to pay those high margins, which is certainly contributing to a great bonus for your distribution sales rep.
Tyler, add one additional thing. I think that there is a lot of underestimating the amount of time that you have to put into your distribution discussions and negotiations because usually would do that with your primary resin provider when you go direct, but there's a lot of time involved in those negotiations and discussions, condition, and talk to your suppliers, understand what their positions are. And in the past, that really was the case.
Very much so.
I wanted to take a quick moment. We will have some time for questions at the end. If you do have questions, we have a chat feature which you can drop those into. Apologize for not referring back to that earlier. Great discussion, guys. Now that we have those pitfalls that folks are dealing with in mind, let's talk about what's next. That's what everyone cares the most about. 26. What should buyers be evaluating right now? What things should they be rethinking as we move into next year?
Yeah, Michael, that's a great question. This is the perfect time of the year to start thinking about that. But revisit your category strategy, especially for distribution. And a lot of people buyers will concentrate their efforts with the primary producers, but they really don't revisit their category strategy for distribution. The other thing is, you may have something that's 3 to 5 years old, and that may have worked back then, but certainly the landscape has changed as we pointed out. And certainly that strategy may not be as successful. Thinking about your dependency on distribution, is there more risk or less risk? And really understand where your channel manager relationships are for different distributors. I mean, that is really one of the things that's underrated now that there's consolidation in the industry.
One thing I think that's really important here, and it may seem basic, but I've seen roles that I've taken over where they didn't have this mapped out. But even something as simple as drafting the structure of what your current state is, right? We get this resin from that distributor that's made by X producer. Just knowing that, I think a lot of folks just say, "Oh yeah, that's the M Holland resin, or that's the Osterman resin," right? Okay, but it's not. It's the resin that was made by some producer. So once you map that out and you have it in front of you, you now start to have the chessboard set. You now know who the players are, and from there, how and where to start driving some of those consolidation conversations. I do think that for the most part, Michael, you and I have talked about this in the past, Kevin as well. As much as plastics is a commodity business in some aspects, it's still very much a relationship business. Typically, some distributor or some sales rep is going to be the difference on the service that you're getting. And when you have somebody that's trustworthy and is servicing your account well, that's when I think you have the opportunity to partner with them and work on shifting volumes, doing some share shift and solving problems together. And as Kevin mentioned, that's a time intensive project, but it's also a very trust intensive project. So,
Yeah.
if you start with mapping out where you have, and then you start to look at what distributors you want to work more with, I think that decision is often based on the relationship and the trust level that you have. But then once you take that trust level, and an executive might say, okay, I get it. You're buddies with your sales guy. You like this company, but really you need to put down what kind of margin do we think that is fair for a distributor to have? And can we agree on that and negotiate to that? What kind of reliability do we have? What is the service levels? Do you have any ability to stock safety stock on our behalf, or lower the MOQ that we might have, right? Some of these very tactical and very procurement driven activities where I think I've often been a believer that once you write something down, a problem well defined is a problem half solved. So once you have this mapped out and you have your requirements, I think that really is going to drive where to go. And then we're going to continue to talk about how to get there.
Yeah, Tyler, that's a great conversation because if you look at it, oftentimes people just look at the dollar size, and that's great. But there's so many other forms of value that we require, with minimum order size and on time and complete, to run an operation. If those fall by the wayside, then regardless of the price you have, there's other hidden costs in operations that you're kind of, incurring. It's a good point.
I just want to circle quickly back to the relationship piece. I mean, it is so critical in our industry, Tyler, and you brought it up. Some of those relationships are changing because of some of the things that we've talked about. I mean, let's put it out there. I mean, there's been quite a bit of turnover at some of the private equity companies. Nexio and Formera have both seen, levels of attrition with their sales team approaching 40, 50%. And so knowing that who you work with in distribution and, that could be changing, that alone is reason enough to revisit your distribution strategy. But again, you want to make deeper connections with these companies. And we've talked about it in prior webinars. I mean, we certainly had a talk around, the myth of being small volume and that perception that means you have no leverage. You want to get higher and deeper into these organizations, and you have the opportunity to do so with some of the flux with the people side of it right now.
And people change, to your point, and also as the ownership changes, I know that particularly I was working with a resin distributor that we came up with all kinds of creative solutions. I mean, like throwing spaghetti at the wall, see what sticks, and we drove a lot of value through just building a great partnership. But then when they were acquired, the rules changed. It was, Tyler, I can't do that for you anymore. Different policy, new people. And that starts to say, okay, well, if that's the stance you're going to take, that's different than what it was before. And that's also the same stance that all your competitors are taking. So, you know what, you've lost that competitive advantage that you had with our account. And like it or not, that forces my hand to go back to the marketplace and say, okay, this advantage of being creative and maybe doing some things and taking on a little extra risk based on the trust of the relationship. Well, now there's a corporate policy that we don't do that. And that just forces a different conversation and more competitiveness in the marketplace if that's how we're going to standardize things.
Great discussion, guys. Let's bring this even closer to real world. We've talked about some of the theoretical situations, but a lot of this gets very messy as we put it in practice, as you guys put it in practice, and as we help clients do so. I want to walk through a few real world examples that we see and how we would handle that.
Yeah, one of the ones that I got a little bit of a bone to pick with is the share shifting one. So I've been in positions where, again, I was buying resin from 3 different distributors, but we're all manufactured by one producer. And that, just as a procurement professional, that just drives me bonkers. I mean, I cannot stand that somehow I was unable to remove a supplier at $50,000 a year and consolidate them with one that was $6 million a year, right? I mean, that is low hanging fruit. And the way to ultimately achieve that, right, is, you're the salesperson from the distributor with the small volume doesn't want to help you. Obviously, they want to keep that volume. And at the high volume, they'd like to help you, but it's like there's a hesitancy, like, especially now that Ravago has an umbrella with all these companies. If you're buying LyondellBasell from Bamco, and an M Holland, and you want to consolidate with one of those two, Ravago doesn't really have an incentive to enable that. Maybe, and I'm just using LyondellBasell as a producer example here, nothing to do with them particularly, but the producer doesn't really have a incentive to achieve that. Just you, the customer, does. So the way to actually achieve this is that you go back to your sales rep and you say, on your own company letterhead, we are partnering with X distributor, and we want all of our resin to be, only sold through this distributor. This is not a move that you can pull off every year, by the way. This isn't like an RFQ thing that you just keep doing, because the channel manager at the producer is going to catch wind of this and say, you're causing too much noise and administration nightmare for me, and the only one benefiting from this is you, and we're going to stop this, right? So if you're going to accomplish this consolidation, it's a one-time effort working with your distribution salesperson to achieve a consolidation that you're writing up on your letterhead, and together you're going to the producer to pitch this. That has a pretty high success rate, but doing it in any other way, or trying to reach out around your distributor to go direct to the producer, oftentimes that's a door slammed in your face. So maybe save somebody some time on that approach. That's one that I've had some frustration with, but also some success with in the past.
I think about kind of the private equity element to the distribution model today. There's a lot of changing of terms and conditions, and sometimes tightening of credit terms. And in that scenario, there's a couple different options you really have. One, you could look to source the item or items from somewhere different, and do that research. And a more proactive approach is just kind of approach them and say, look, understand we have a lot of smaller transactions and so forth. Maybe we can do monthly billing, something that helps you guys out on the billing side, something administrative. So there's some creative ways that you can handle that, especially if you have good credit and you pay on time. Certainly, those are things you can negotiate.
I think there's also like anything in procurement, there's a volume tiers to this, right? And the lowest tier is if it's less than a truckload a year, if we're talking 10, anything in the low thousands, really, pounds a year. When you look at consolidation or even price negotiation, just like you don't get to $1 million a year in savings by saving $200 on a truckload. It's the same way that a resin salesperson doesn't make their bonuses on 10 to 12,000 pounds a year either. So those ones, I think they really are a tail spend. And if you want to get them consolidated, as we mentioned, that might be a lot of letterheads. That might be a lot of maybe small qualifications that just don't have the ROI. One way you can help with that is to get your salesperson interested in helping with that, is to make sure that your distributor has a bit of wider band of orders, right? Don't just give them all the tail spend. If you have the opportunity, make sure you can anchor that relationship with one or two little more larger appetite SKUs, something in the 100,000 pound range. If you have it, I think, or more, it starts to be significant for the distribution folks. And when I was in, large resin procurement where we were buying billions of pounds a year, I thought distribution was like a swear word. I thought it's just added margin. It's just, how do I find a way to bring this direct to the producer, right? You guys got to stay out of here. Eventually I realized that there are some generic prime programs, and there is a fit for rail car, even multi-million pound deals to run through distribution. Not everything has to go through a producer, even if there is occasionally a savings there, particularly if you need them for the break bulk. And that's where the negotiations can kind of get creative, because the margin is a little bit larger on and a little more opaque in the engineered resins and in the small MOQs. But what you should be paying for multi-million pounds of resin becomes very clear in the marketplace if you're at that large of a commodity base. So you might have to negotiate the commodity portion to within a much smaller margin range, and then allow for a little margin in the middle to make a good mix of an account and to drive overall value for your organization. So I think there's really just the three tiers to it. You have to use distribution, and you're going to get out the checkbook because it's really small. You have a few 100,000 pounds, and now you can start to consolidate and trade, and then always be looking for opportunities in that maybe 3 to 8 million pound range where a distributor could really fit and really help with some commodity, with generic.
Okay. Well, if you walk into 2026 with the same distribution strategy that you had 4 or 5 years ago, like we've talked about today, guys, and thank you for sharing those examples, you're already behind. And the landscape has changed, and your strategy should evolve as that landscape has changed. So I wanted you some of the few takeaways from today. I think the main one that resonates for me is the landscape having changed. But what do you guys main takeaways?
Yeah, other than the landscape changing, I think if you look at, buyers need to reevaluate their strategy, not just on pricing, on service delivery in all aspects of their supply chain. The other thing is you look at it strategically, not as a commodity transaction. In the past, people looked at distribution as more of a transaction. So change the mindset and look at it strategically.
I agree. If you're passive in this space and you're only focused on either direct business, or maybe feel like it's just a little too complex and my resin guy seems really nice or gal seems really nice, and you're just passive about this, absolutely you're going to leave money on the table. And as resin prices rebound from these historic lows, the people being passive are going to feel it the most. And I think understanding how your distributors' relationships impact your leverage and your table stakes. I think that, again, it's a relationship business and that there's nuances to how to solve these problems, but partnering with the right distribution, knowing what resin that you're buying and who's producing it, and then partnering together to drive a strategy in that arena that's the winning ticket for 2026.
Thanks for that, Tyler, Kevin. This has been great. We are doing well on time. 35 minutes planned, and we're 36 minutes in. So let's pause here. We can open things up. Any questions from the group? I'm going to put a couple things in the chat here that I'll get to in a second. Any questions? Kevin, Tyler, anything you guys want to double back to and emphasize again?
I think that, like we've kind of stressed if we're not looking at this strategically, and it's going to definitely give you a challenge next year when the market starts getting tight, when volumes start rebounding. Right now, the pricing level of most of the commodities has been relatively tame, but that's certainly going to change next year to a certain extent for different resins.
One thing I love, I can't remember if it was Bill or Garland, but I think one of our owners has said, talk to many, work with a few. And I love that strategy in the distribution space. I think that if you have any type of significant resin volume that's going through distribution, I would absolutely answer a phone call from Osterman and Shaw and Emha. I mean, get to know the reps out there, get to know what the options are, listen to their pitches. I mean, one of the reasons why producers are going through more distribution channels is because they're starting to say, I don't care how it gets there, I need the volume. Like, resin producers really are caring about volume and market share right now. So with that dynamic changing, I think that's an opportunity to take a lot of phone calls, right? To hear how distribution is also becoming more competitive and what they're doing in this changing landscape to provide you more value. So talk to many, work with a few.
Yeah, I would also say when you talk about distribution in general, a lot of times when you have a growth area, you kind of say you kind of get in this mode of like, well, I'm always going to be in the distribution space. Understand when you have the ability to kind of go direct. Sometimes you just assume that things are going to stay in that areas. There might be opportunities if you have significant growth on the horizon for your business.
We've got a question here from Maddie Boyer on an example of the type of volume that would push you to see if something was a candidate to move from distribution to direct. Certainly, from my experience, this is very much is this a commodity or is this more of an engineered materials type conversation? But I'm going to give you guys the opportunity to weigh in on that.
You want to go first on this one, Kevin? Because I bet my answer for engineered resins might be a little different than yours.
Yeah, I think in the commodity resins, if you talk about rail cars and you have silo capacity and so forth, that really helps out to go direct. Obviously, the producers are looking at turning the rail cars several times a month. So if you have 2, 3 rail cars minimum to go to start with for one item, that would be something that would be considering to go direct. If you're talking about truckloads, boxes, and that type of thing, that's typically the type of business that producers want to have distributors handle. So it really
So
depends on volume and throughput.
I
So
remember
two
it
to
was
three rail cars, what's that annually? 4, 5 million pounds?
Yeah.
Yeah. I was going to say, I mean, from my experience, it was like always 10 to 15, right? It was a bigger number, but it seems like over the
Okay.
years, especially with the market being fairly flat now, that threshold seems to be coming down on the commodity side.
Yeah, in my time, it was usually if it's less than 5 million pounds, if it's 1 to 5 million pounds, like we'll hear you out. What is it? Is it convenient? Is it a commodity grade? But if it was 10 or more, then it became like, well, something about pigs and hogs. But let's just say that, basically there would be a candidate for going direct. On the engineered side, though, it's quite a bit lower than that. I've seen producers, go direct with 200,000 pounds of, 300,000 pounds of polycarbonate or ABS. That's a little bit more of a significant volume on the engineered side. I think a lot of engineered resins goes into smaller components, so it's can be difficult just to get that volume. We're not making high density polyethylene trash cans, that you roll out to your curb on Tuesdays, right? That consume a lot of resin. It's like more components. If you have a couple 100,000 pounds in the engineered space, I think that certainly can open you up for a potential conversation.
And just one thing I wanted to add on the commodity side is in this environment, the last couple of years, there's been a lot of additional PE capacity that's come online, as well as polypropylene. So that type of capacity has to be absorbed somewhere. So producers are willing to kind of flex that threshold down just to get the volumes that they need and so forth for their investment. So there are some that in the future maybe that will change, but for right now we're definitely oversupplied with capacity in most of the commodity areas, and that's why peas exported quite a bit.
Right. Well, very good. Don't see any more questions coming in, so we'll plan to give the quick wrap up here. Again, Tyler, Kevin, thank you so much for your time. Thanks to everybody that's joined us today. Hopefully, it gave you a clear picture of how this dynamic with distribution really works, and again, not just the public-facing version, but some of the operational dynamics that are behind the scenes that can help you as the buyer navigate. And look, if you're sitting there thinking about wanting to benchmark your pricing, wanting to reevaluate your strategy before 2026, I mean, there's still time. There's still tools out there that can help you do that. One such tool is our ResinSmart data analytics platform. Everybody that signed up for that today gets a free trial of that for 60 days. The link is in the chat. For those of you that are already ResinSmart clients, I encourage you again to log into the platform and check it out. The link for you is also there in the chat. And if you want to kick it around with Tyler, Kevin, myself, the team, your particular distribution strategy, we get into this on a basis with our clients. We get a lot more into the weeds even than what we talked about today. So we're happy to set up a conversation to walk you guys and gals through that. So with that, thank you again for joining us. Massive thanks to Tyler and Kevin. Have a great rest of your week and a fantastic weekend.
Thanks, everybody.
All right, take care. Cheers.